Mentioning Sweden's approach to managing the COVID pandemic is like giving someone a Rorschach test. The responses it engenders are all over the map, and they probably tell you more about the person responding than they do about Sweden or COVID-19. Critics of lockdowns applaud Sweden's original approach, which relied heavily on voluntary measures. Public health proponents, however, note that Sweden has suffered unnecessary illness and death, all to protect the economy. So, which is it? Did Sweden thread the needle, striking a reasonable balance between public health and economic well-being? Or did thousands of Swedes die unnecessarily, with little to show for their sacrifice? Today, we're going to try to figure it out. Welcome to I Wrote This Podcast, the show in which we noodle our way through timely and interesting issues. I'm your host, Bob Neese. Thanks for joining in. Compared to its Nordic neighbors as well as to other wealthy countries, Sweden is a bit of an oddball when it comes to managing the coronavirus. For various reasons, when it came to managing the pandemic, the Swedes relied far more heavily on voluntary restrictions than did most other advanced countries. The result? Well, probably more sick Swedes. But, at least from a policy perspective, the two biggest questions are, one, how many more people died because of their approach, and two, what did Sweden get in exchange for this increased mortality? As of early January 2022, Sweden has had a bit more than 1,500 confirmed COVID-19 deaths per million people, Denmark about 570, and Norway about 240. If we assume that these three countries are identical other than their approaches to managing the pandemic, and admittedly, they're not, then Sweden's policies so far have led to at least an additional 1,000 deaths per million. What does that mean in terms of the absolute number of people who have died? The population of Sweden is about 10 million, so the absolute number of excess COVID-19 deaths attributable to Sweden's looser policies is about 10,000. We got that by multiplying the 1,000 extra deaths per million people by Sweden's population in millions. Just an aside before we go any further, some people find it a little hard to do math while listening to a podcast, so we've included more information about the calculations and assumptions in the podcast notes. You can review that whenever you'd like. If Sweden only had a bunch of excess deaths and no associated benefits, we'd probably all agree that it's not such a compelling policy. In fact, earlier on in the pandemic it appeared as though Sweden's economy wasn't faring much better than that of its Nordic neighbors. But a more recent analysis suggests that Sweden's economy has done slightly better than the economies of Denmark and Norway. Specifically, economists estimate that Sweden's GDP growth is 1/4 to 0.75% better than it would have been had it implemented stricter policies to manage the pandemic. We can use this estimate to get a sense of the likely economic benefit associated with Sweden's looser approach. Sweden's GDP, in US dollars, assuming purchasing power parity, is about $55,000 per person. Given a population of 10 million, that means that Sweden's GDP is about $550 billion. If we assume that Sweden's policies reduce the impact of the pandemic on their GDP by 0.5%, those policies prevented about $2.8 billion in losses. Okay, so Sweden lost more lives, but they did better in economic terms. Now the question is whether that was a good trade-off. To answer this question, analysts use something called the value of a statistical life. The statistical part means that no one really knows which specific lives were lost or gained as the result of a policy intervention. Those details are left up to chance. An example might help to show how this works. Let's say that the value of a statistical life, or VSL, is set to $5 million, and we are looking at an intervention that will save lives but incur economic losses. If we can gain additional lives for, say, $1 million each, policymakers would say that the intervention is cost-effective. The $1 million cost of saving each life is a bargain relative to that $5 million value. On the other hand, if the same policy costs $20 million per each life gain, analysis will conclude that it's too expensive relative to the benefits. At this point, some of you may be thinking that this whole exercise is distasteful because human lives are of infinite value. This point of view resonates with a lot of folks, me included. The problem is that if our governmental decision makers make policies that assume that lives have infinite value, we will soon run out of money to pay for them all. It's fine to say that we hold human life as infinitely valuable. That sentiment isn't the problem. The trouble arises because societies don't have infinite economic resources to match. Setting a numeric bar for the value of a statistical life is one element of making sure that we're saving as many lives as possible given a fixed set of resources. Now, let's get back to Sweden's policy. Here's a way to think about it. Imagine that you are a policymaker in Sweden. You can take the Danish approach and implement stricter restrictions in the hopes of preventing deaths, or you can adopt a looser strategy. The tighter approach will save about 10,000 lives, but there's no free lunch. Implementing these tighter restrictions will trim about 1/2 of a percentage point on GDP growth, costing your country about $3 billion. And that means a Danish-like approach will cost about $300,000 per statistical life saved. The official Swedish stance is to use $3 million as the value of a statistical life for policy making. In other words, the Swedish line is that policies that save lives at a cost of less than $3 million are a good deal. The bottom line is that Sweden's approach didn't clear its own bar. By adopting a stricter approach, Sweden probably could have saved lives for about 10 cents on the dollar. And if you're an American policymaker, the Swedish approach looks even worse. That's because officials there use a VSL of about $10 million. Of course, this is all a back-of-the-envelope assessment, so it's reasonable to ask what would have to be true for the Swedish approach to be cost-effective. Well, to achieve the target of $3 million per life, the GDP savings from Sweden's policies must be 10 times greater than currently estimated, or the number of lives lost to Covid-19 from the Swedish policy must be 10 times less than currently estimated, or some combination of the two. None of these things seem particularly likely, but admittedly this is a rough analysis. There are potential limitations to this back-of-the-envelope estimate, so I'd like to mention some of them before you all have a chance to do so. Potential limitation 1. There could be an enduring benefit to the Swedish economy. I agree, at least in theory. Specifically, if this is the case, that 0.5% bump in GDP would apply for more than 1 year. The report cited earlier looked at differences in GDP growth through the end of 2020. I checked figures from the OECD, looking at GDP growth from the fourth quarter of 2019, pre-pandemic, through the third quarter of 2021. The latest available figures, Denmark was actually doing slightly better than Sweden, which raises some doubts about a longer-lasting economic advantage for the Swedish approach. Anyway, enduring effects would have to magnify the benefits by a factor of 10 to make the Swedish approach cost-effective. There is little evidence that this is the case. Potential limitation 2. The benefit to the economy could be greater than 0.5%. I agree, and the economists gave a range on their estimate that went as high as 0.75%. But for Sweden's approach to be cost-effective, the true benefit would have to be something like 5% instead of 0.5%. This would seem to be an impossibly large figure. Potential limitation 3. The difference in per capita deaths between Sweden and Denmark could have nothing to do with how the former managed the pandemic. I agree that this is a possibility, and there is some suggestion that Sweden was more aggressive in assigning deaths to COVID than were other countries. But because the benefit to Sweden's GDP appears to be so small, these other possible effects would have to be pretty big to change the conclusions. Potential limitation 4. There are other benefits that aren't captured by effects on GDP. For example, Swedes probably derived pleasure from avoiding some of the harsher interventions that were imposed on the Danes. This enjoyment is probably not completely captured by the change in GDP. In addition, Sweden kept schools open, which probably advantaged their children in a way that's not captured in short-term GDP. Okay, that's all fine, but these other effects would have to be about 9 times greater in value than the direct effect on the GDP. This seems like a tall order. Potential limitation 5. Although the Swedish policy itself might not be cost-effective, it prevents the government from sliding down a slippery slope in which they gain too much control over individual behavior. That's a possibility, but the problem is that anyone can use this kind of argument whenever they want, to veto almost any strategy regarding any issue. I admit that I don't know Swedish culture very well, and maybe there's good evidence to suggest that the Swedes in government would jump at the chance to grab control of the lives of their fellow citizens. Potential limitation 6. This whole approach ignores the violation of fundamental individual rights attached to policies such as those employed by the Danes. The framework I've used in this back-of-the-envelope estimate absolutely does focus on the ends and ignores the means. Maybe tighter restrictions is a bridge too far. Ethically speaking, I don't think it is, but I haven't made that case here, so the critique is at least plausible. But whatever, if we want policies that work, then we cannot turn our heads away from the outcomes they cause. There are also probably other warts in this estimate that I've failed to list here. If that's the case, please leave me some feedback. I will take a look and share my thoughts. So where does this all leave us? This quick and rough evaluation suggests that Sweden's policies for managing COVID-19 failed. Specifically, the policy has led to more deaths per capita than comparator countries, but has not saved enough MOMY to meet the government's own targets for the value of a statistical life. By this standard, based on what we currently know, it's reasonable to conclude that the Swedish approach, so far, hasn't really worked very well. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. That really helps get the show noticed. Also, be sure to subscribe to I Wrote This Podcast wherever you download your podcasts. If you have a comment or a question about anything you've heard today, or if you have a suggestion for a future topic, please send us a note at I Wrote This Podcast, all one word, at thatradioshow.com. That email address one more time is I Wrote This Podcast, all one word, at thatradioshow.com. Oh, and one more thing, if this podcast sounds a little funny, that's because it's also an experiment. All of the audio from my voice was generated using AI technology. Hopefully the show will sound different and better as the tech improves and as I improve at using it. I'm Bob Neese, hoping you have an amazing day. We'll get together again soon.